Welcome to the Crash Chords podcast.
Yeah.
Woo!
Yeah. Enthusiasm. Lots of enthusiasm.
That sounded fake as hell.
Yeah, it really did.
We're thoroughly enthused.
Sure you are. We're back. I'm Matt.
I'm John.
I'm Steve.
Some quick stuff up front. I kind of really want to get right into the album because there's a lot to chew on. But we're in a new month. It's March. This is our first episode of March. I want to talk about our March guest, which is going to be our further quest to have the Wasties on individually, as I previewed before.
And many a time.
We are having Robert on this week. He's going to bring us an album by... He's already chosen it, but I will save that for the week before. But he's already chosen his album, and he's also going to play some stuff from his other band, The Rose West, on the show live acoustically, as well as a Wasties song as well.
So, like Painless Parker last week, would Robert also refer to him as a polybanderous individual?
Yes, he's in the same bands that Noam is in, except for Painless. Actually, no, he is in that band, because when they played with multiple people,
then
he was one.
Yeah. Oh, well, then they're just, okay.
Yeah, they're
the polyhamabanderous...
What? Who?
Polyhamabanderous.
No, it's polybanderous.
Polyhamabanderous. As in they,
like
the same.
Gotcha.
They and the
he
same.
is polybanderous, but they are polyhamabanderous.
Yes.
Got it.
You have to write that down, because that's a great word. That's a really cool word.
He's building on the word that... He's building on what Noam created, because I believe he came up with polybanderous. They had a bingo card at one of Steampunk World Fairs.
I'm good at furthering existing art.
Bands or 4 bands. So, Robert will be joining us at the end of the month, so I'm excited about that. Mostly also because I'm a huge fan of the Rose West. They do some really great stuff, and so I'm glad that we'll be able to bring some of that on the show. The other thing I want to promote is St. Patrick's Day this year, March 17th. We are having a cross-section of bands mentioned and guests. Waystation is doing a great, big St. Paddy's Day show that they always do with the Wasties, but this year, 3 Pints Shy are opening for them, who are also a very Irish-influenced band.
Couldn't tell.
And the Rascals and Rogues, which Joe Rude is a part of. All 3 of those bands are playing together. They have song overlaps from the classic Irish tunes that they've done, some more traditional stuff. They have overlaps, so it's going to be one band, another band, the third band, and then the final set will be a giant jam session with all 3 bands, which is going to be a lot of fun. So don't miss that. I will be there. I guess this is a good place to pass it over to John, who's brought us our album this week.
John?
This week, I have brought something I hoped would be a little unusual, and it did pan out that way. Kangding Ray, a musician I heard about through the grapevine of electronica, random stuff I was searching up online. He is sort of self-proclaimed, sort of lumped into the idea of cinegraphic electronica.
Cinegraphic or cinematic?
Cinematic, cinegraphic, something.
Okay. A sinful guy.
A combination of real club orientation, but brought down to a more ambient level. So it's an unusual idea. It's done in the realm of electronica. And from the first time I heard Solens Arc, because this one I've been listening to for almost a month now.
That's the album name, by the way.
I was hooked. I was thoroughly hooked on it. It was... something that I found myself immediately just going back to other bands we've already done, such as Boards of Canada, Tomorrow's Harvest.
Sure. Apex Twins.
Aphex Twins. Aphex. There is a P, but it's Fex.
What's with your words today?
Aphex Twins was going back to even stuff like Evergreen, just the more orchestral orientation, ambient type of music we've been listening to. The theme music. The setting music.
Well, for those listening, we reviewed Boards of Canada, Tomorrow's Harvest back in episode 54, and Aphex Twin back in his album Zero back in episode 126, which was not all that long ago. And both are techno in their own right, but of course, Boards of Canada goes back to a more ambient side, tends to be slower, tends to be more severe, and then Aphex Twin, I think, is a little more from an art techno perspective, but it's more upbeat. You can groove along to it. It has kind of like this little funk unifier. I think that's how I referred to it several times in that episode. And, these are the different spectrums that techno can give you. So,
what was
where
interesting,
does he follow?
That's the whole thing. He's more of a middle ground between these two ideas. And that's what I latched onto. That's where I'm making the comparisons, but also the contrast. It was interesting to see something that was kind of in the realm of both and not really committing to one or the other. That's why I decided, got to review this one.
All right.
I've been talking about this up for months with off the air, but got to review this one.
Well, let me point out that the guy's name is David Letellier, and he was born in France in 1978, lives and works in Berlin. I think he's French-born, German-raised, perhaps, or German-moved. Lives in Germany. Anyway, he studied and graduated architecture in Rennes, France, and Berlin. He's kind of got the visual angle, he's got the architectural, the 3D angle, and then he's also got the music angle. So he's interested in, from a pretty broad standpoint, we've got a lot of bases covered here. But this is specifically from his website right here. David Letellier focuses on the perception of sound and space, on the edge of architecture, sound, and art. His work, ranging from audiovisual performances, sound installations, to autonomous machines and conceptual drawings, can be defined as an attempt to express sound as a form in movement. I find that absolutely fascinating, and certainly all areas of his education has served to support this.
His art pieces, which he actually has different from the Kangding Ray work, are frankly like scary cool looking, scary ideas of physical objects that are shaping as they're producing sound, or just throw it out there, pieces of movable materials interacting with one another in an audio sense. That he brings to the Kangding Ray work. In fact, when he first created this album and put it online, for Solens Arc, he created a little bit of a blurb, and I'm going to read that now because I think it captures his idea fairly well. A stone throw just to watch it fly. A projectile launched for the sole purpose of drawing a ballistic trajectory in the sky. The Solens Arc is what remains after the subtraction of the goal, a simple parabolic curve defined by gravity, impulse, and starting angle. No target to hit, no catharsis to wait for, just the beauty of the flight. The arc is the purpose, in the form of 4 variations constructed from disintegrated melodic textures and dismantled beats. Each of the sequences are assembled seamlessly into dense, evolving compositions while keeping their autonomy and their role in the global dramaturgy. Pointillist serial loops morph into abrasive raw anthems. Broken club rhythms are refitted into uneven patterns, like deconstructivist sound architectures. Industrial techno-stompers dissolved into granular sounds waves and filtered space pads, before being overtaken by cinematic drums and rising arpeggios.
I gotta say, I love that entire blurb. I mean,
that's like a thesis piece or an opening rendition from like a Metro Modern art piece.
I was saying earlier on that if this, let's say, was like, my senior project, for instance, back in music, the composition, I mean, this would be like, I'd be groomed for the next postgraduate study class, or connections would be made between me and my former composition professor, and he'd be like getting me, oh yeah, you happen to have an apprenticeship and all that. It's a spectacular idea, but it did bring me to an interesting, I guess, gripe that I had here, only because, of course, it's in the liner notes, and because it's art and it has the explanation behind it. The explanation is for us as sort of a premise going into the piece, and as I always say, well, sometimes you don't have that. Granted, of course, if you bought the thing and you read the thing before you listened to it, then you have it, and then it's in your head. But music is the kind of thing where some of these things should be not necessarily self-evident, but you need to be open to the idea that impressions will take different listeners different places, as opposed to the liner notes or the overall concept that the artist wants to gear us in such a direction. So, we had an interesting discussion before we recorded about the line between the music video, for instance, and the visual art piece incorporating the audio element. And we're going to talk more about this after the review, but certainly this is a case where we need to take into account impressions that one derives from music first versus the impressions that one derives from the art first. What you just heard from John, well, that's the art. We're going to try to gear this by addressing our interpretations as well as our interpretations through the lens of what he just read.
The interesting thing about his description is that when I saw the title Solens Arc, of course, because I'm a sci-fi nerd, I think Solens Arc is the name of a fleet ship or some kind of, spacecraft or warship. And so hearing Solens Arc as literally an arc through an airspace or an arc of momentum was interesting. I didn't actually even think of that.
A simple parabolic curve defined by gravity. I mean, it doesn't get any simpler than that. And in a certain sense, this album will be very, very easy to, I guess, define and convey along those lines because you can see a lot of elements crop up. But again, we're going to address both sides of the coin because there is emotions that I think this album brings to the table that are, and could be, to other listeners, completely separate from this entire concept. So let's begin at the beginning. Track 1, The Serendipity March. Now, I find this to be a fascinating blend of benign pulsations, somewhat industrial. It does have the character, I think, as we often refer to, like of a steel yard, something in the distance, something metallic, something man-made. But it's as if it were viewed through a very warped lens. I mean, for one, it's drenched in reverb, to the point where you can almost feel the humidity in the music. There's a coldness, and with that, a stillness, but these imply all natural forces. And one of the main reasons I interpret this as industrial, which of course is man-made, goes back to that Steelyard claim, like I'm just surrounded by metal and distant mechanisms driving some unseen and perhaps figurative engine.
This is achieved through a combination of that heavy distortion work, which creates a steamy, hazy atmosphere to it, and the echoes, the expansive echo, almost call and response with single tonal work. Mm-hmm. This gives you a distance. That combination is very dark, a little bit chilling, but definitely leaning more towards the side of charcoal as far as the color schemes goes. It's dirty, it's grimy, but it's not in such a way that it's not evil in any sort of way. It just happens to be kind of polluted with this.
Like, for instance, if we go back to one of the main descriptors of this band, cinematic, you picture that these kinds of, scenes. Not so much as if cinematic is going to imply, oh, well, he's composing in the vein of John Williams. It's not that kind of cinematic. It's in the vein of, of directing style itself, and that with each musical motif, he's conveying these different directing angles, and perhaps even the filter on the said angle. So what John just described as charcoal is almost like those old-fashioned 16mm videos that you might use as an amateur filmmaker to give a newspaper conveyance of the color.
Yellowing, sepia tones,
a poor quality black and white, where everything is muddy and charcoal and dusty.
Literal things that they do nowadays, such as just if you want to do a war scene, you got to splatter some mud on a camera lens or something like that.
Yeah,
something just to add a little bit of extra character to the framework in which you're working in here.
Of course, and it should be said that all of this is in just the first 20 seconds. I mean, then there's a transition in here where it introduces much more chaos. The high tones are shifted to low ones. We get ripples and this disconnecting, kind of jarring, radiation pulse that just takes over, that suddenly lands us in the meat of this track, which is so much more threatening.
Well, because the meat of the track gives much more of this kind of post-apocalyptic robotic society feel, almost like Blade Runner, the cliche ones.
Not necessarily post-apocalyptic, but definitely
futuristic, industrial.
Severely industrialized.
Yeah. And it also, these tones, Serendipity March, the rhythm becomes this kind of marching feel, almost as if soldiers are marching, whether they're robotic soldiers, human soldiers. It's not specific, but it gives us kind of marching feel, like it's moving through this industrial scene.
It's more of a societal, in my opinion. I see it more that way, purely with the industrial backdrop. It's less the Great War, kind of a march to me, and more of the evolution of time. Society moves on. It becomes more and more computerized. It becomes more industrialized. It's less our primal nature, our tribal nature, and more the growing society. But this is definitely a cyberpunk kind of a turn.
Funny, because I came at this from a third angle. This is to me, it goes back to that directing comment again. That as opposed to just the filter that you're using in your lens, I think it's also a matter of putting you in various environments, different settings, placement of the camera. So we just described the first 20 seconds as being somewhat distant, again, a Steelyard feel. It's vast in scope, and you get the echo and the reverb that go with it. But that's just the beginning. Then the transition brings us like directly into the heart of that engine that I discussed earlier. So we go from being almost on the perimeter of something broad and expansive and almost maybe deeper than you can understand. Like the kind of machine, of course you mentioned Blade Runner, Matt, and and there's like unseen forces that run that world. A futuristic world is of course going to be more complex than anything we can imagine, but of course our world is probably more complex than anything, pre-industrial societies could possibly imagine. It's that kind of just taken to this new level when you are in the heart of this machine, you feel overwhelmed by it all. Yeah. Much like, let's say, some caveman would feel if he was just dropped in the center of Manhattan. Like, what is this? Yeah. And I feel it's very much in that vein. I tend to think of the movie Metropolis, the silent movie Metropolis by Fritz Lang, 1927. I mean, there is some scene work there which just serve to do the same thing to those viewers. It's just you're immersed in this environment, and it's supposed to overwhelm you. It's supposed to make you maybe aspire to it, but also fear it at the same time.
Yeah, and I mean, musically it does that too. The tones, sounds, and rhythms are very mechanical sounding, and they have this kind of rhythm that adds to that scene work. It really pulls you in. It's got a very strong setting, which I like, especially for an introductory track. It's nice to have a strong setting that kind of pulls you right in.
And the build work, the transitions from sections are less defined, but the introduction of different elements are so nice. Just going and adding in a little bit more of a high end, or a little bit more of a low end, or a little bit more of a mid level.
It's subtle. It's not like transitions necessarily. You don't get more sections. I maintain that you have.
He brings something from the background into a forefront position that wasn't even there in the beginning. He's drawing threads, drawing additional lines of music into his piece here,
which is another cinematic tactic. Because of course, the thing that would govern foreground background work is focus. So it's like he's changing the focus on this piece itself. But as far as sectional work here, of course, there really is no variation apart from the intro, the transition, and then the content itself. From there, you really are just looking at those individual things. You get thumps, you get horns, you get sort of this brushing motion. A very important element is the breathing, which implies that apart from the overwhelming machinations surrounding you, there is a human labor behind this. Otherwise, I wouldn't expect to hear breathing of any kind.
Yeah, and I mean, you do stay in that for a while. I mean, it really doesn't change up after that until the end of the track. Through the meat of it, it's this. There are flourishes and there are moments, where with a lot of techno artists, they will take these little beautiful moments and kind of sprinkle them through the track, which gives it some peppering. But by the time we hit the midpoint to the tail end, it gets a little repetitive. We're hearing the same tones and rhythms and beat work over and over again.
Until the very end, when in the outro, where it seems to wind down just a little bit. Not the rhythm itself, but the texture again. I feel like it's a little less overbearing, or like the listener, has just again been relocated. Just like, in directing, of course, placement is all about setting and scene. Put me from the outside, the perimeter of the world, into the heart of the world, and now it's like the machine is just winding down.
Well, I equated it to using that guide work with sound in a directorial fashion. It's like you're in the heart of it, and then during this swell and then breathe at the end, it lifts you above the city, and you see the sky above the polluted, grimy city, and you get a breath of fresh air, where a title would scroll across the screen.
Right, and to go along with that, you get more of like a musical bent stepping in here. Like, for instance, there are a lot of people who probably wouldn't describe the majority of this track as being very musical. It's sound art. That's what it is. It's playing around with movement and motion, just as it was described in his write-up here. But certainly toward the end, he starts layering in things that have more of a pleasing tone to them, just pleasing textures, familiar synth sounds that we hear in other techno. Yet, I of course have to bring this back to what you mentioned earlier about the concept of it feeling like a war zone, like a post-apocalyptic war zone. You were the first to bring that up, Matt. And apart from all the impressions that we brought up, remember, we do have to consider this, as I said we were going to, in the light of both viewpoints. The art that was described by him in the liner notes. And that makes me think specifically of that Solens Arc, the idea that there's a projectile being sent out here. And there's nothing more nothing brings projectile to mind outside of ballistic missile of kinds. So I do tend to lean, when I have that in mind, I tend to lean toward this warlike environment where I should be afraid, not necessarily of the machine, but of maybe death.
Yeah. And I mean, also the idea that we know that there's an industrial kind of thing. We don't know what it's making. It could be making war machines. It could be making something. So, I think, and I think we get a little bit of...
Sure, that's actually a very astute observation.
And from here we go to track 2, The River, which is the only real kind of interlude track we get on the album. We get an expansion on this later.
There's more than one interlude track, but this one is most definably an interlude because of its overall length.
It's only 25 seconds, and its namesake suits it. It flows like a river, briefly.
I don't want to use the word interlude. I want to use transition.
It's a transition. It's a full track it's a transition that's a full track on the track list.
It as a transitional piece, because each in this album itself, and we'll talk about this now, going from 1 to 2, and then into track 2 to 3, the tracks are actually squared away in groupings of 3, and there is a flow from one to the next to the next. Outro goes straight into intro. He blends the sounds through for these 3-pack arcs.
Groupings of 3 for a total of 4 groups on the album. Right.
And with The River, I found this to be one of the, while short, most beautiful pieces he used to really get us moving from point to point.
Yeah.
The River lives up to its namesake. It is very appropriately named. It's listening to the robot version of a babbling brook, the robot version of flowing water. It's moving unto itself. I really got emotional with this song.
See, I have to withdraw from that just a little bit because it seems like we've replaced a little bit of that mechanized feel in this track. It seems like we've tried to drift, and this is another observation I had almost throughout this record, is that it seems like it wants so frequently to convey something human, just like the breathing that was straining to be heard through the previous track. In track 1, it was almost benign. It was in the distance. It wasn't integral, but it was there, and you couldn't unhear it. And here, it seems like this is lifted up a little bit, but even so, it's fleeting. This track is 25 seconds. There's not so much content here, except for the breather as it serves as a transition. So I found that the rhythm itself, which was not really present, it was replaced by these slow, broken swells with higher notes, just like almost piercing sounds, dotting it. And then within that, you have these momentary chord changes, continuing the types of things that were present in the outro before. The outro had more pleasing textures, familiar synth sounds. It's the same kind of thing here. It just opens it up a little bit more. It's like a melodic tone is just yearning to surge forth, but it's inhibited by mechanization.
And that's I love that. I love that summation. It's not 100% natural in its feel. Using things like broken, pointed, precise. I mean, these are a lot of the adjectives you just used. It's describing a little bit too sharp on the edges of just a natural idea. Think of a river itself. It smooths down the rocks. It flows through the path of least resistance. Even a waterfall, if you look at the rocks itself, is curved over. It hits a big pond that just spreads out in a wave. But these edges are a little bit too clear-cut to be fully natural. And that's what really keeps it fresh for me and keeps it very emotional for me.
For sure. And it does seem like it really loses out in the end, because I think in the last 10 of these 25 seconds, we do get the heartbeat. It does start to step in there, and that's the heartbeat that once completed at the end of the 25 seconds is the basis for the third track, Evento, which is clearly more upbeat. I mean, I think it just takes that heartbeat just up a little bit of a notch, because of course there's other stuff here. But this is what's interesting about Evento. It was hard for me to discern whether, by saying it's upbeat, that really equates to it being psychologically more intense or more lighthearted. Because speed is kind of funny that way. Quickness implies more urgency, but with that comes, the ability to dance to it. This goes back to, the spectrum we were talking about earlier. If I can groove to it, then maybe it's more like the FX Twin kind of Zero project. So obviously that would add a layer of, enjoyment to this. But then when you look at slowness as opposed to quickness, it's just so much more severe. Like the first track, there's no grooving there. It's existential dread through and through. It's fear. And then all of a sudden I enter track 3 after the transition, and I don't really feel that anymore. I feel like upbeat really does mean the first instance. It means upbeat, and I think I found this a little less impactful for that reason.
Well, it starts off beat, but it has a very muted quality to it. I equated it to music being played in a separate room. You don't have the direct sound hitting your ears. It's trying to break through the wall. And as this song goes along, it seeps. It breaks through the wall, but it doesn't actually just break through. It oozes through this wall. It goes in spurts. Different elements are introduced as it goes along, and these become more present and then fall back, and then become more present and then fall back. It's not breaking down barriers in this case. It's merely making its presence more known as it goes along.
Sure. It's not as strong, I feel like, of scene work, specifically focused scene work as the first track was. You get flourishes, but more or less, it's more closer to what John's saying, where you don't get a specific scene, you just get this feeling, this movement.
And I think it's really more the soundbite exploration than anything else. This is another one of those tracks, well, it introduces a variety of things. The texture is overall pretty similar, but we add things like vocals saying indiscernible things. Again, that vocal just like straining to be heard.
That comes in the intro, actually.
That's
right
in the
after
intro,
the pounding
right.
beat, you get a little bit of an electronic vocal, and then it's followed by like these synth keyboard flourishes throughout the song, which are just these kind of high moments. But like they don't really give a feel like the flourishes did in the first track. In this, they're just kind of
they're regular, but that's the other thing. Like they come in, they're periodic interludes, so they don't have this freestyle element to them. Again, everything is very rigid. Everything comes down to the end to the mechanization of the album, which governs everything. Like in this case, those keyboard flourishes, they step in like how a song would typically divide up phrases if this were a song, and you would have a phrase in a single you'd have perhaps 3 or 4 instances of that, and then there's always that breather moment. It sounds more human-like, but at the same time, it also has reason behind it. It has organization. So phrases, I don't think is so much breathing in this album. In this track. I think it's really more the cyclical patterns like any machine would have. You know, there's always that it needs to follow its cycle. Every gear needs to follow the cycle. That's it. Before it passes down to the next thing. It's like an assembly line. And that's really the best way I could describe this track. And, you know, assembly lines aren't the most interesting things in the world.
I mean, well, the only time I've ever found this assembly line interesting is in all of those Looney Tunes commercials where they have bum bum ba-na-na-na, bum bum ba-na-na, and they're like showing all the parts moving.
Or the machine that does nothing and you just see, it's Pee Wee Herman did that, I think.
Yes. And so, but on a serious note, also with this track, I felt like the first track we mentioned it getting repetitive, but it was more towards the end of the track. We were pretty much on board the whole time, and we didn't really notice a repetitiveness till the end. Here, I noticed it a lot sooner. Because, like you said, even those flourishes became pretty regular pretty quick.
I think halfway through we do get some new things, like there's a different pulsation that takes over. Again, it's very subtle, you barely even notice like it arrive. It's just suddenly, oh, that's there. And it just built up slowly. But it's kind of like a bass synth whirring in the background. I liken it to like truck wheels on a highway, heard at some distance. You get that that tapping over and over again, but it still sounds like it's against concrete. So you keep the industrial feel, I suppose, in that way. In fact, to some extent, I think the whole track made me feel like I was on a highway. That's another, I think, interpretation I would have from this. It's like things are in motion. It's this unstoppable force, but you know, there's that upbeat nature. I can't really look away. So it's not like the dread that the first track gave me that I'm in the middle of a machine. Instead, now it's more like, well, I'm in motion in a more free flowing, pleasing kind of motion. That's the best way I could describe it.
But I think that just gives more dimension to this setting that was created in the first one. Like, it's not all dread in the heart of the city. Like, as we talked about last week with depression, like, being in the heart of the city can be very oppressive.
I think
but there are expansive places around the city. And so, like, I think that's what this is supposed to convey.
Sometimes it's supposed to convey wonder, like Metropolis. That's actually, if you avoid the scenes which are, you know, focused on labor strife and all that, there are a lot of scenes in that are just they're just thrilling to watch. It's almost like an imagination of the future that we all hope will be the thing, you know, without all the bad stuff to go with it.
But also it's important to focus on something you mentioned about the free-flowing nature of this highway feel, because it connects really well to the fourth track, which is the reprise of The River.
But there's a divide. Of course, this is the end of our first arc. You know, there's a signifying end to this track. It doesn't just bleed straight over.
Yeah, it stops, and then we get pretty much a return to what we had previewed in track 2, but in a little more fleshed out version.
A little more.
We get 2 minutes and 25 seconds instead.
This is the same yet completely different. If you were watching The River in the first rendition, the reprise, I would liken it to being within the river itself. There are whirling noises going past your ear, just long drawn out notes, like we actually got in the previous arc, but here they're a lot more muted. At the same time, we're getting high, chimey, airy work on top of it. Very fleeting, very clear, and very well defined. For me, this immediately visualized just being in the depths of a river, seeing bubbles floating through the water itself. It was an extremely strong visual for me. I can't get away from it. The fractured nature of these little edges, though, keep those bubbles still crystals instead of just perfect spheres. The distortion-heavy whirls going by keep it as less water and more some sort of silicon-water amalgamation. I don't know how else to describe it.
Well, I mean, it's tough because... Well, I gotta just point out initially that this is the earliest reprise I've ever heard on any album.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's true.
Usually
they come at the end.
Granted, the last track was like 6 minutes, but my memory's not that short. Give me some credit. So I figured, by the time we get to this, it's like, all right, well, we just heard that. But it's true. It pushes the boundaries. It pushes it so much beyond the capabilities of the first instance of The River. I mean, I think the main emotion that I would use here is more desperate.
Yeah.
I think there was an emotion that you simply can't accomplish in 25 seconds. I think for the first time I actually started to hear a narrative in those upper screeches, the keyboard. I immediately pictured Blade Runner. I immediately felt the desperation and the overbearing nature of that Blade Runner city. But I feel the emotion behind that. It's not just the city itself. It's the person who's trapped. And I think this is the closest this album may have gotten to that perspective, as opposed to this removed sensation that the rest of the album is pretty good at, actually.
And speaking to that specific part of the track and emotion, I equated it to a game that me and John are very familiar with, Steve not so much, called Mass Effect. And there are a lot of moments in Mass Effect where you have that expansive, almost emptiness of space that feels like... floating through empty water, floating through empty space.
Perfect idea is the actual beginning of the second part of the series.
Right.
Where the main character is sitting there, his air tank's busted, and it's just a long, straight pan out.
As he's floating away.
Yeah, this little astronaut dude, as he's stuck, he's running out of air, everything's dying around him, blah, 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 blah. That scene, but I definitely see the connection that you made between the two.
Yeah, and it's got the technological parts of this song remind me of that too, because Mass Effect had a lot of whirs and sound effects in the music that with rises and falls, and this track has that.
There's not a lot of... I think this is another main thing that helps this track over some others to me. I think in the end, the regimented beat work of other tracks is a bit of a detractor for me, as it is with a lot of techno, because sometimes it demeans the audience a little bit. I understand that there's need for regiment and structure, but that's not everything. I think, honestly, with this whole texture, you can accomplish more when you remove that and you just focus on some of the ambient work in the background. It doesn't mean you have to remove rhythm entirely. I think there is a rhythm here. In fact, we get our only beat in this is like every several seconds. And over that, you actually do have kind of a melody. As I pointed out, there's a bit more of a narrative in the keyboard. And it seems like even though the keyboard really is just comping along with all of this, along with those swells from beneath, it's like once you're consigned to the fact that a melody will never actually arrive, you can start looking at the keyboard comping as the melody itself, because that's your only frame of reference. Those are the high notes. They're there. They're providing more character. That's what's providing the narrative that I heard, the human touch. All of that is just... It was beautiful in this track, and it culminated in a single moment that I could easily describe as the climax of this track. and maybe one of my favorite moments on the album, to be honest. It was a single moment, and I could pin it down to about 1 minute 40 seconds, where you get the beat. You get that beat that I described as only appearing every several seconds between all the swells. That's the climax, and then we get the decay on that. But here, we get that followed almost immediately by a short beat, just maybe like half a beat, an eighth note or something like that. And on that beat, we get this beautiful seventh chord. And there's not a lot of chord work in the majority of this album. So when you hear something that all of a sudden is dense, and I don't mean texturally dense, but tonally dense, then it stands out. It stands out quite a bit. And I love that slight delay that they included, because the beat that we're accustomed to, you would almost expect it to sync up at the moment. Well, that's the moment in which the chord is going to come, but there's that slight delay. Again, whenever anything deviates on this album, it's probably going to be my favorite part.
No, I totally get that. And I think that the hammered keys that you're describing, essentially, this almost pressing on a physical keyboard, really stands out in the song, especially which is not a very long song to begin with, but it adds even more character to it.
Sure.
And I'm kind of... this is another case where I think our different interpretations are just marrying up in different thematic levels.
Yeah. Not one is more right than the other. They're all right in different ways.
Space oppression, far-off reaches, physical oppression or emotional oppression that Steve gave, being deep underwater and seeing little bubbles of hope going up through the air. I mean, we keep tackling these guys at different angles with the same sort of idea.
The only thing we haven't really touched upon is, of course, the guiding focus of the album, which is his concept here. So I keep wanting to go back to that Solens Arc and that idea of ballistics. And I'm still somewhat, removed from all these. I guess when I look right down to it, the arc that I see is really just maybe the individual tonal arcs, and then, of course, the arc that we just had over the course of those 3 tracks.
Yeah.
Here, in River Reprise, we begin a new arc. And I do have a sensation of this album kind of renewing itself, I think, at this moment. It hit home harder than some of the previous tracks. So that's about the only bit I get. I understand that I'm looking for very complex things here. I'm looking for everything he referred to before. I'm looking for disintegrated melodic textures and dismantled beats. Sure, I see that. But the arc as the purpose of that's a tough one. It's a really tough one. He's coming at this from a high art perspective, but it's something we need to sort of keep in the back of our heads as we keep going.
So going on to the follow-up track, track 5, Blank Empire. This track actually goes in a bit of a different direction, a little bit. We still have, from the moment it starts, the beat work that they give us, it still has that kind of industrial feel, but the overtones change quite a bit.
It's a didgeridoo in this case. I don't know how
I didn't hear that at all.
No, the whirring is almost feels like a didgeridoo. To me. But at the same time, because it's so reverbed, mechanica, blah, 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 blah.
Now, all right. I think I know what you're talking about, but that's just not what I would refer to as a didgeridoo.
Yes.
I got this... This track absolutely fascinates me, but it's because of how simple it is. I would just call that static. I mean, let's put certain things aside here. There's not going to be any bizarre instrumentation on this album. He's working with a pretty confined palette. And especially in this track, it seems even more confined. I mean, beat and static. That's like the whole gamut here. And the static itself is almost like this called orange, like a war horn. So maybe that's where you got didgeridoo from. But it's interesting. It comes across as sort of like a hemiola to me. I first felt this like in 3, and then I felt it in 4, following that steady thump in the background. That's your beat. That's your quarter note. 4 of those per measure. 4 measure cycles. Nothing complex there. But then over that, you get that sort of swelling fuzz sound, which is another way of it's a war horn when it continues straight, but when it pulsates, it just sounds like electromagnetic radiation, the kind of pulses that you would get in sine waves. So I would go more toward that. I'd lean more toward the electrical metaphors than, for instance, the man-made instrument metaphors, which I feel like I just need to kind of leave at the door here. But we get these, when it does enter in with these sine wave swells, that is against the beat in the background. That occurs every 1.5 beats, so in total it would be 2 for every 3 beats. And then there's a phrase break. That's just a spell of silence for the fuzz that appears over the 4th measure, where it's just completely silent while the thump just continues on. And that's your 4-measure cycle right there. 3 measures of that hemiola with the fuzz against the backbeat. In the 4th measure, it's absent, but the backbeat continues. But then we start, as, again, the subtle changes just absolutely fascinate me. The further we get into this track, we start focusing on some other... We add some other effects, for instance. We add, like, more frantic electronica sounds. We add, like, this brushing every 4 measures. And then after a while, that fuzz is no longer going forth in the sine wave. It's just a steady tone. It is just, like, for the duration of 3 measures entirely, it's just a single flat tone. Then it departs in the 4th. Then it's steady again. And the I couldn't even notate the moment in which it reduced the sine wave portion and just became a steady tone. Couldn't note the moment because everything happened so gradually.
I love the way that matches up to the idea I got from this track as a whole, as a thematic piece. It's just taking the title alone, Blank Empire, something great and built up and encompassing a large area, but blank, without character. It's building something, but it's building something that in the end just seems like it just lacks character, it lacks individuality. That's where those steady 3-measure blank tones come in. This is now starting in my mind.
Well, that 1-measure black tone. That
1-measure blank tone.
3 full, 1 empty.
It's just sort of deleting the character out of the actual song.
If you consider the character to be that war horn, or didgeridoo, or fuzz, or static, or however you want to interpret it.
Or some sort of just distortion. Something that's breaking up from the normal, almost repetitive thumping along of the movement of the music. Mm-hmm. So something was breaking up, and it's smoothing it out. It's trying to make it, the same. Trying to make it a steady tone. Just building up the thumping as opposed to adding color itself. This adds a lot of extra texture to just an overall theme of the story itself. Just an overall idea. It's creating a cohesive unit outside of just the 3-song arcs for me.
Mm-hmm. Speaking to what Steve said before, though, musically, I want to comment on aesthetically, since there's a lot of strong visuals in the music in this album. The tribal sense I got from the rhythms in this felt more of like an old world within the machine city, this kind of human element within the technology. And I mean, the most famous version of this, or one of the more famous modern versions of this, is Zion from the Matrix movies. The idea of this tribal, almost prehistoric group of humans within this dark machine world. And I got a sense of that from the music here, because it does have that tribal feel while not completely removed from technology.
And of course they tried to do that in the big dance sequence in Matrix Reloaded, which, regardless of your opinions on the movie, which is perhaps questionable in the broad, I mean, I guess I like the symbolism as a little thick as it is, that we have to have something extremely human. It was almost like an orgy, practically. It was like a dance/orgy, is how human and animalistic can you get, to contrast everything that surrounds them, which is very, very mechanical.
And the tail end of this track kind of represents kind of focusing in on almost 2 humans in that animalistic matter, because it gets much lighter and more focused, as you said, because the rhythm falls out.
It's certainly interesting, and I do find us ping-ponging back and forth between, like, oh, is it tribal or is it machine-like? Is it tribal or machine-like? Because I just went through that whole rant, and I was like, well, maybe it's a little more machine-like, but I see it, it's like I said earlier, I see it poking through. I see the human element poking through, and I guess even within the regimen of this track and how orderly it is, and I described the hemiola and everything, it's you do hear it. You do hear this desire to be tribal, I guess, at the same time. And after all, it is called Blank Empire. That it's an eyebrow raiser of a title. Blank Empire. It makes you visualize something human that is bereft of its humanity.
Yeah,
and that's an interesting concept just for titles alone.
And what I like about the outro is, as it gets lighter, it really leads well into, and I cannot pronounce track 6, so please someone take a stab.
L'envol.
It's as good as it's going to get, I think.
But I follow your transition here, and that is important. That whole camera tightening in on, like, 2 people toward the end of that.
Showing that passion.
Mm-hmm. And you get that, of course, everything starts to strip away, and that's how Blank Empire closes out. by the time we get to l'envol, I mean, first of all, it's important to note that in French that simply means flight. So obviously, and this was evident even before, we looked up, because we're English, we looked up the word, but it was evident before that this is a much more soaring track. Spacier was one of the words that we threw around there, but honestly, I feel more air in this track. Like, you can hear the air being cut by, like, let's say, jet engines, or, for instance, the sound a jet engine would make when it's in the distance, and it's cutting through the sky, but you're too far to hear the engine itself. You're not hearing the engine, you're hearing the air being cut by it, which is an effect that happens long in the trail of the airplane itself. So I just love that sensation, which that's what flight is. That's soaring.
Cinematically, it definitely does that cut from zooming in to shooting to the sky above the city, and it does give this expansive, soaring feeling. I mean, you feel like you're in the air above whatever setting we're in.
And in this case, there is, for me, undefined but present character in the sharper, higher register synth work. The light flurries is a main element that stays throughout. I mean, he's doing a lot of contrasting between long sweeps and sharp notes.
I would like to define that by 3 elements here. There's 3 specific effects that are taking place. And one of them is that sort of mist rolling in and out. That's what I defined earlier, is like the air
whirling,
being cut.
The whirling.
Right. And then another one is the high synth sort of keyboard work, but not quite keyboard work again. It's just like these overlapping gurgles, so to speak. And then the other is that really long tone that I think you're referring to, but except it occurs in 2 tones specifically. But it's like this open, warm, almost Gregorian chant kind of tone. At least it has the reverb of being set in, let's say, in like a cathedral. But it's just 2 tones. And this is a little tonal observation here, because again, these are scant opportunities with which to bring them up on this album. But this seemed like the track that really most wanted to resolve to any kind of home, but it never can. There's that slow ambient drum in the background. It again just consists of 2 notes, E and D, and then it fades away. Now, had there been a C there, had it just gone that one extra whole step down, then we would have a nice, pleasing, if predictable, 3-2-1 in the major scale. But there never is such a resolution. It's built off of that delay and that lack of a resolution. And then, interestingly, the other dominant sound, this cyclical, almost irritating pattern in the higher notes, like an alarm of sorts, it, I believe, is using the notes E, D, C, B to kind of gurgle around. So it does go down to C, but it goes further than that. It goes down to B, which is your 7, past the major scale, and past the tonic to the 7. And once you land on 7, of course, that B robs it of resolution. So now you imply this awkward Locrian mode more than anything else. So it just keeps this further unstable, which is why when you contrast that sound with the fact that throughout the entire track, the main warm tone never changes from E, D. And there's a pause, never resolves. E, D. All the chaos is just, it keeps this unsettled, unresolved sensation throughout. Absolutely love that.
It comes off as it lives up to his name once again. It's the flittering travels of some sort of like almost unknowable fairy creature.
That's one thing I didn't think of.
It's just hard to pin down on this little character that is just, it's traversing a space.
I mean, I kind of get a feel also, I mean, it's not so far-fetched. I mean, it doesn't really fit in this setting, but almost a superheroic kind of flight. This kind of, like, think about the first time you saw Superman fly in the Superman movies, that kind of beauty of expansive soaring. I get a sense of that, a very cinematic flying scene. It doesn't have to be Superman specifically, but that kind of cinematography.
It's a very easy comparison, of course, toward the musical observation that I just made, and it's simply that if you have no resolution, you haven't landed. You are still in the midst of flight. You are soaring continuously, and the resolution would ultimately be your touch upon land. But since everything in this album revolves around the concept of there being arcs and parabolas, and you're just in the air, perhaps even making some kind of like flirtation with space itself.
And this is perfectly exemplified by the fact that these high chimes, the synth, the character of the song itself, leaves before the song ends. It doesn't resolve. It flies up. It actually does a kind of a fade out. You hear it less and less and less, and then it's just gone. But the other two aspects of the track, the wind, the expanse that's there, is all that you're left with. You're just looking out upon some sort of desert area.
Well, it was one thing at a time that it strips away. I mean, I remember that it stripped away. I remember at the end it leaves you with just the ambient drone. That was a sure thing. Just the ED, and it's funny that when you hear it alone, it almost sounds like a foghorn in the distance, like without the mist itself. So I guess that's an appropriate analysis of this. If it is soared away, then you're kind of just left with the drone of space itself without your character or your present thing. So it's an interesting, if abstract analysis, but you know what? We're in abstract territory.
That's true. I mean, but the most interesting thing about John's theory about this track is that when we go to the next track, track 7, Amber Decay, is we are ripped from this.
No. No.
It is a new arc, though. He's correct.
It's a new arc.
That's the main reason.
True.
That's the main reason, and there is a reason for it in my eyes.
Okay. Well, so Amber Decay has the most sudden start we've gotten, and the first track to not start with a heavy beat of any kind. We just get this kind of looming, aggressive, almost growling machine sound.
We get very slow vibrations within, like, the overall pulsation. I mean, obviously the pulsation has been present, throughout. We get a lot of that, but within that, there's like these slow, singular vibrations, which of course makes everything, makes the low tones, where to the point where if you play a tone so low, you can actually hear those individual vibrations. If you play a really high tone, well, you can't hear any vibrations because they're too fast for the human ear to perceive. Well, here you really get that growl. Every single vibration is present. And then 45 seconds in, gotta throw this in because it was another one of the special moments on this album. We get a slight dip in the overall tone here. Just a pitch bend, as if you were on a keyboard and you just used the little pitch bend wheel on the left there. Well, that functions as our transition to the main section of this track, which is, I gotta say, it brings back the steady beat, which I'm not always thrilled with because it robs the album of a little more flexibility, but it's there, and again, it keeps it more like a more danceable kind of traditional techno, let's say.
It's a me and Matt both said a metal hitting wood kind of a beat, or just two wooden pieces. It feels natural in a lot of ways that a lot of this album just hasn't, especially when it comes to the beats. But it's not the only element that just makes a slow burn into it. The previous track, or the previous arc's character of the flying synth, I guess we might want to call it, eventually makes a reemergence here. And that's when I realized the growl is a new character in and of itself. It's not a steady distortion of a note, because it doesn't come in on the same beat or exit on the same beat within a single measure. The growling is off-putting. It's sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, but it has its own cycle in the macro of the song itself. It's a primal machine. It's almost like a mechanized guard dog.
But it does bring to light the fact that in this album, and I got to bring it back to form, of course, because when you leave the ballistic territory, then you could start putting in whatever you see as we go here. But it's important that because we're in the beginning of the new arc, it's like, well, what is your character? We keep referring to this character, but we're talking about ballistics here. Your character, you interpreted a superhero in the previous track. Well, you could also be missiles, and the aggression that I feel in this particular track, it's like we're kind of brought back to that warlike feel here. Like, if the moment of departure from the ground is going to be your most aggressive portion, how can you blame the missile mid-air?
Well, that's the thing, is if we're actually equating it to a missile on the last track, I imagine watching a missile fly through the air without the context of what it's doing,
without the crash, without the launch, without the impetus,
probably looks very majestic flying through the air. And I think that's a good point. But there's definitely an aggressive nature in this track that we really haven't seen before. There was some muddiness in the earlier tracks, but this is where we're really getting very aggressive.
The first track I felt more dark, but not aggressive. It's true.
This is definitely way more in your face. The first track was
probably one of the more threatening. No, not threatening is not the word. The first track, I think, is the most severe.
Yes, but this one's definitely more aggressive, threatening, and in your face. And it really feels like there's an antagonist here. We'd have a protagonist in moments, whether it was the city or the people or the street or the steelyard. This, we really have an antagonist, this growling robotic guard dog, if you will, or whatever it is.
I was very intrigued by the title Amber Decay because I was struggling to think what the decay was when you're clearly at the beginning of the arc. There's a hole, but I'm sure there's a reason. I just haven't thought of it.
Well, I mean, an amber decay, I mean, if we use amber as its mineral form, or like this idea that amber can preserve life, it's the decaying of life. I mean, think about back to Jurassic Park, that one mosquito is preserved in amber, almost kept alive all those years. The idea of this amber that's keeping the human race alive is decaying. Everything else is breaking down around it.
There's also, and this will tie in later when I do a big theme discussion, the idea of encasing something you think is perfect and watching it still fall apart. Because amber is a very severe way to try to encase something. Just think about, well, you have a pet or something that's actually living. You encase it in amber. Yeah, it'll be perfect, but it's going to look dirty. I mean, amber adds a certain hue that kind of leaches the life out of something. Besides killing it in the amber itself, it doesn't look as clear. It's smoggy, it's dirty, kind of a look to it when you got something in it. As a gem, as a jewel, it's got its own brilliance, but anytime you start yellowing something, it adds a little bit of, well, decay to it.
That's interesting. And what Matt has said is interesting. I don't know which of you is really on the ball here. I'll throw in my 2 cents. Only because I think we're a little off base. But, this is what you got to deal with. I think I'm a little stuck on the concept of this nature versus technology bent. I still think that's a thing. And, of course, if you perceive amber as the preservation of life, and this is going directly back to what you said, Matt, then to watch it decay is to watch life itself decay. But what I see recurring throughout this album is all these different references to, or at least tonal references, textural references to ballistics, to warfare, to that. I can't ignore the aggression. I can't ignore the threat. In that case, it's like you're almost indicting humanity for its own downfall, in a sense.
Well, technically, in any story where the machines rise up and crush the humans, it's because the humans created those machines in the first place, therefore sealing their own demise. So if that's the angle, that's very apparent in most science fiction.
We're off base. I'm pulling it back.
All right.
Well, I'm pulling it completely back here. Anyone have any more comments on this particular?
Do.
All right, bring it.
This is one of the best parts of the album where I feel like his phasing into foreground and background is really just top notch. The different elements coming in and out. Well, once they get into the song itself, into the piece itself, they stay. But just the way they're presented and competing with one another. Sometimes that growl really does take a backseat.
It does. It takes a leave of absence.
And it's great when these different elements are, well, being showcased. I love it adds texture without having to really complicate it overtly.
And there's more instrumentation. There's a little stick work. There's like beeping becomes almost constant. There's a lot of different things. And then the outro, of course, brings back that like deep synth that almost plays like a melody to close us out. It's very odd, but it comes across as being extremely sorrowful. So I won't completely disregard everything that we've said right now. I do believe that this track, in some sense, is implying some kind of ultimate downfall, especially when you consider just the natural musical arc of the track, which is what we ultimately go back to in the end. The emotion that you're left with is just simply, you started out with aggression, and then all of a sudden it peters out like some kind of sorrowful epilogue to something's existence, whatever that may be. Whether that's the mosquito in your ancient block of amber, or that's humanity as a metaphor for the mosquito, or for the dinosaurs, as it were. Again, all we're going off with is the word amber. Otherwise, none of this would ever be mentioned. But the emotion is left.
Yeah.
Let's go from that to something a little different, because again, if we consider the actual arc here, not the musical arc, but the ballistic arc, this is the most appropriate word for that kind of thing. It's called apogee, and apogee is the highest point in the development of something. It's your climax, it's your culmination. And this was pretty interesting because, again, we're dealing with just maybe 2 individual subjects, musical subjects, and we trade between these 2. Again, much like directing, one is in the foreground sometimes, one is in the background sometimes. The first I describe, and both me and Matt pointed this out, as being almost like a hedge trimmer. It sounded like something loud, but something relatable. A machine that it feels like it could surround you. It flutters. It sounds like it's weed whacking constantly. The second sound is this synth whirring in the background. I know we get a lot of that in this album, but this time it seems like phase in rhythmic pulsation. Almost, again, like cosmic radiation. So here, I see this as a reflection of the same thing I noted in the previous apogee track, the flight, for instance. Actually, that was the latter half of the arc. That was something that was still in mid-flight and it barely touched the ground at the end. Things just sort of stripped away. But in this particular arc, we get the real culmination. In fact, I don't think anything has ever been higher. If we're just looking at altitude in this album, I don't think anything has ever been so thin and so, as I called it in that track, a flirtation with space. That's what I hear here, especially in that pulsation. Cosmic radiation is a really, really important thing to note, and I thought of that before I even considered this as apogee. I'm like, oh yeah, that's the highest point in development, and yet I heard cosmic radiation. There does come that point, and I love, you see certain videos of the people who try to make these highest free fall evers. That was a recent thing, only maybe a few months ago. Sometime in 2014, there was this man, I believe he was French, and he combated the record that was previously held by an American going all the way back to the 60s for the highest free fall ever. And it's done by a balloon that is made out of a very, very thin fabric because it needs to go higher than any other balloon practically. And from there, he needs to be in a full-on spacesuit because he's practically in space at that moment. Talk about apogee. This is the moment where you need to go down, and at that point, it's silence. It's ultimate silence. You are essentially in space. And that's kind of the impression this track gave me.
Its lack of additional layering almost comes off as vacuum as well. As just the previous tracks, especially within this arc, there's a lot missing. A lot less clutter, and it's almost a ringing in your ears to go from Amber Decay to this and not have those elements present. In several ways, I would almost liken it to the previous 2 characters, the previous 2 individuals that may have been the protagonist, antagonists of Amber Decay, are now holding their breath. They're no longer doing anything. This almost comes off as one of those moment tracks. It's one of those ringing, long-scale instances. Because everything that was there previously is now paused.
Well, I think also the lack of drum machine, more or less, in this entire track gives way to that impression. It's
mainly that thin nature of the track that you're dealing with, again, just those 2 subjects. So, not to hammer home my interpretation of this, but it's almost like it was trading out between, again, talking about human sounds, human impressions, versus something that's a little more external, more electronic. Then this track, of course, would be pursuing like almost a heartbeat on one hand, and then, of course, your radiation the other. Your perception of yourself versus your perception of the external, of the fact that you're at the edge of the atmosphere or on the brink of space. It's just, that's that trading back and forth. You're focused on yourself, you're focused on the external, you're in awe, but at the same time, you're kind of concerned for your well-being and your safety, because humans weren't expected to live in such environments. It's a concept, but I don't know,
If we're gonna talk,
I enjoy place in this album. I think setting is very important.
If we're gonna talk Kangding Ray's a proclamation of what this album is, this is the most idealized parabolic height. This is that moment an arrow traveling from a bow stops being able to fight gravity and just hangs there for that single instant, and then makes a descent back to Earth. It is the most idealized top of an arc right here in this song.
Whatever arc you're talking about, whether it's my interpretation or whether it's just like, if bow and arrow, very close to the ground.
Like anything.
It is the concept
that
before, as he said, gravity starts to take over. My point is, of course, whatever you're referring to, this track, I think, is as close to his envisioned arc of this album as any other track that we've previously had. Because we've offered a lot of other interpretations and a lot of other just musical impressions that could completely remove us from his point, his subject, his work as an artist. But this one, I never even needed his liner notes for me to get what he was trying to get at, as of this track, at least.
We move from this track to track 9, History of Obscurity, which brings us back into the setting that I think we've been talking about a lot before. We're back in the city. We're back in that more electronic and machine feel.
But it doesn't start off that way. It does have those kind of wood tapping percussions from previous work in Amber Decay, and it's light techno tones, light electronica tones that slowly supplement, well, at first complement, but then supplement the actual initial offerings of the track to such a point that by the end, it's very much an electronica track. It's a descent.
It starts more natural, and then the electronica almost starts to overtake it as the song progresses. It's a slow transition.
I agree with both of you. More toward Matt in the sense that this begins again more in that like tribal, threatening, like something is on the horizon kind of sense. Because it struck me as like almost, again we go back to the war drum pattern, but I don't know, I'm hesitant to even say tribal because it felt more organized. It felt like this, like an entire civilization's drum pattern. Everything is organized. In this case, the drum falls in the first beat, falls on the 2 and then it falls in the 4th beat. Then we get one measure of reprieve, and then we follow the same pattern again. The 1, the 2 and then the 4. It's a kind of war pattern which when you play out on that rhythm, it really might sync up perfectly to, let's say, one of the Roman Empire's approaches in, let's say, back in Ben-Hur or back in Spartacus or any movie concerning like an ancient empire. It's threatening, and yet it sounds organized. It sounds very much like there's entire worlds are being moved in order to make this approach and make this aggression. Perhaps, again, I'm just thinking about this because of the title, History of Obscurity, so I'm thinking in the past a little bit. These things you can't avoid. Maybe you can avoid his liner notes, but you certainly can't avoid titles. But there's other things here that sound very organized, like the synth presents itself as this very organized downward arpeggio, and then repeats that every single measure. Then periodically we get these gongs, that kind of aids the war chant feel. And then we have this tapping that sort of tapers off. I believe alternating the drum pattern. That appears one measure, and then later in the track, the other measure, the measure where that drum is silent, is taken over by the part where the tapping occurs, just like a fluttering tap, and then it sort of tapers off like an echo until it's down to nothing. So I kind of get the sense that it was almost like a slant on maybe civilization itself, like, cyclical patterns of like warfare and decline, a lot of this stuff. Earlier in the album we were thinking more in the future, well now I'm thinking more in the past. Certainly if ever you think tribal, well, that's probably going to bring you to a non-mechanized state. But still, they used mechanized things. Again, warfare is always mechanized.
Well, the mechanized is not super present in the beginning. It slowly builds, like we said,
it was still
to
pretty
supplement.
Regular.
But it becomes much more prevalent, and towards the end of the track that...
It's not River.
No. Towards the end of the track, there's nothing but that mechanical tones.
At the end, sure. We didn't get to the outro yet. That's when the...
This, to me, just the way it, like I said, complements and supplements, is the transition of history. Is going from our more primal nature into a more industrial, into a more cyberspace-oriented society. Going from one to the next to the next. The pure to the blended to the mechanical, the electric.
It's important to say history of obscurity because, well,
but
civilizations rise and fall, and then all of a sudden they're forgotten.
it loses a lot of character when it goes into that cyberspace type of a thing, and when it goes into the purely electronica pieces. It's in another light, in another way, another interpretation I got for it. It's a supplementing of the carbon-based into the silicon-based.
How do you see that?
Well, the wooding tapping, the more breath that's in the beginning of the track.
But what we really get at the end here is a complete stripping again, like he's done in earlier tracks, stripping of various different subjects. You strip away the main beat, and then all that's left is that echo, that tapping. And then finally, at the very end of the track, all that's left is just that arpeggio. So,
I said, but that's just the beep boops of electronics.
So
just
you
the
see
silicon.
So all of a sudden now it's the modern civilization that has disappeared. This is the entire history that he's presenting. Because I would be on board with that.
In this light of the carbon being supplemented by the silicon, it's more like individuality and the mind being changed and just uniformed into just a series of ones and zeros. It's a full character that reached such great heights that eventually falls down and loses its individuality that we had in Apogee.
In that case, I'm just going to supplant your word choice. I think carbon versus silicon is not what this is going to. I don't see those words here. I think this is simply pre-industrial versus industrial. But even that is only based on the outro, without which I wouldn't even have that context.
No, I'd argue that only because the electronica takes a huge part of this song prior to just the outro. It starts becoming really the forefront element. It replaces how the beat work was going. You stop being able to hear a lot of the more natural tones in relation to the electronica tones because the volume's being changed on it. Because the electronica tones are getting more complicated. They're adding little spurts and additional elements while the previous elements from, well, just the whirring and the tapping are being subtracted.
Well, I need to go this far. At least to say that though what we're talking about right now may seem like a long way to go for this particular track, I do believe is the only way to go. Because just as I mentioned that the last track is very close to the artist's goal, I don't see the arc, I don't see ballistics here. I see very little. I think it's the kind of track that I want to hear this sensation of falling back to. I want to see his goal, but I don't. So instead, I'm making up my own story in my head, which isn't by intention. It's simply by facility. I was there, I heard it, and this is what I felt.
I think it's important, though, with all of this theme stroking, to focus back on the music a bit and comment on how, while Steve talks about how this track does stay within a very strong framework and is fairly structured, even though it fades and changes, it gets repetitive. We haven't really had a repetitive moment in a while. The earlier tracks felt a little repetitive, but then we were getting enough that we didn't feel that. But here, because of that structure and these designs that you're talking about, it does fall subject to that repetitive rhythm until it falls apart at the end and changes. And I think it focuses on that change that you're talking about because it changes, it gives that sudden shift at the end of the song that breaks you out of that repetitive nature.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure, of course, we've been analyzing. We haven't really done much in the way of opinions yet, and I'm sure that will be apparent in our wrap up. But I think on this, let's continue our new arc here, because that's a pretty good fade to leave us on, as we have another break for our final arc in the track, which are tracks on the album, which are track 10, 11, and 12, and track 10 is Crystal.
So this song is actually, straight up front, one of my favorite tracks on the record. It has this pretty fade-in with a synth piano on the intro, and this is the first time we really get a focus on an instrument that's not a rhythm or an electronic tone. We really get a sense of a rare moment of beauty within all of this chaos and this madness.
We have a little bit of a disparity again here, because I heard of an electronic tone. In fact, it was very, very low. Like the kind of feedback you'd get from like not having properly insulated wires or something, or copper touching copper somewhere, and then you hear it in your speakers.
It's a very mild roughness to the
very
track.
Mild, right? Which is maybe not how you heard it as electronic, but I see it as incomparably electronic. But we hear it in like crystalline clarity, perhaps because the title is called Crystal. And everything does come across crystal clear. That's important because for the majority of this album, things aren't clear. Things are muddied. Things are stepping through various filters. We've described the word static and fuzz over and over again. And then here, all of a sudden, everything is very, very crisp. So alongside that low electronic hum that I heard, I also heard these like warbling high tones that repeat on a very steady musical motif. But, again, musical. It actually does have chord changes. It plays these little, like, broken chords, kind of gurgling between them, but it has motion to it, and within that, almost sectional patterns. So it was like the only track I could describe on this album is maybe sweet, and it's...
Yeah. Well, I didn't feel it was sweet so much as, like I said, a break in that madness, a moment of clarity.
Like a breath, okay.
Yeah, it's taking this moment within everything going on around them to have this moment, realization, change, shift, whatever it is.
As perhaps as human as it gets.
Yes, exactly. This is a very human moment, and one of the more emotionally charged tracks on the record.
But at the same time, those sweeps have a very hard edge. A very hard cutoff point as you're listening to them. They do rise up to extreme heights, but they stop in an instance. And that was just beautiful. And the first time I heard this song, it was so sharp, I immediately thought of saw blade. Like the actual teeth of a saw. But because of the uneven nature of it, they weren't quite all the same length or the same depth or the same heights as far as the tone was going. It was very uneven, very jagged, and that's what I got without knowing the name.
Electronic hum, because it is stifled several times. That's true.
It's it was for me just you could almost cut yourself on these breaks, and without knowing the name, I had already formed the idea of a crystal. First time I heard this, didn't know what it was called. That idea is almost running your finger along amethyst and hitting that geometric edge, where all of a sudden the plane shifts and starts all over again, and then shifts, starts all over again.
Well, certainly in the way that you describe things that are very angular, which does, of course, contrast what Matt said about it sounding very human, even though, of course, we actually kind of bring crystals. We always associate humanity with crystals for some reason, but that goes into astrology, which I'm certainly not going to do here, because I don't really buy it. But first, I need to address something else. And that's the thing, the only through line that I have been able to find on this entire album that really is just 100% solid throughout, and that's what you said, John, that if there are angular elements amidst the human facade that me and Matt saw, well, that is essentially the entire album. Everything is trying to push one through the other or vice versa. And this is just another track that succeeds 100%. We hear both. We want to hear more of one than the other sometimes, but the track will never give us that full resolve. It'll never yield one over the other. If it sounds emotional, it sounds human, it'll always have something very, very harsh about it, very angular, very, very controlled. The album is calling the shots, and you never get to interpret what you want here before it pulls you back to the other spectrum.
Which I think is also what makes it very cinematic, especially in describing this track specifically. Which I just think is also why it had the most emotional impact, for me personally anyway, because it felt also the most cinematic. From here we go to Transitional Ballistics. So this is the first track that actually specifically references the ballistics that the blurb had at the beginning.
But it wasn't a bullet. Not for me. I think we kind of came to a consensus. This was a rocket of some sort.
So it was definitely artillery of some kind. There's definitely a firepower. This is the most aggressive, warlike track we've gotten on the whole record.
I feel like we said that a few times here, but
this is the most omnipresent, and it really feels like this is a war that's culminating. There is artillery being fired, shots fired.
I would argue that, though. I want to argue that, and that is because the main through line of the rocket, the kind of rumbling, emotional feel, it doesn't land at all. It's just moving. It's another one where we're not seeing the beginning or the end
I disagree.
of this arc. Name the point in the song where it actually culminates.
It's not a matter of culmination in a macro sense. It's a micro sense. There are moments, certain sounds, tones, and percussions that culminate constantly, giving the artillery feel. That's why honestly, I feel like it's a war zone.
The funny thing is I heard it all. I heard every element of it present in this track. This was probably the most... the closest thing, tantamount to a title track on this album here. You get the rocking sounds. You get things we've heard before. You get the air cutting again. And you get this aggressive, engine almost priming itself up for release, every 4 beats. And then each individual sound seems to embody a different form of ballistics, of an example of ballistics. You get angle, you get force, you get impact, and you get decay all at once. From a rocket to water droplets. And the flooding artillery, just sort of priming itself for releasing its weapon of choice. I mean, this is just... Everything is it's a cacophony at once here. Other tracks have been very simple, but this seems to really bring it all together in a big way.
But it doesn't conflict with one another. That's my main point here.
Well, yeah, of course.
They flow around each other.
Well, yeah.
They're working in unison. That is the antithesis of conflict.
Well, here's my median then. Let me just insert a little median between you two, because, of course, Matt said that he was hearing warlike things, and I will take that down a little bit of a notch because, as I said, I see it all. I think maybe you can interpret the rockets right alongside those water droplets. What place do they have in war? I don't know. Maybe they're nearby or something, but that's just too much of a stretch. I see them as just another type of ballistic, in which case you have transitional ballistics. You're going between one and the other, but the cacophony of them together is where I'm inclined to agree with Matt, and that's where it does kind of sound warlike, because it's a cacophony.
But also the water droplets that you're mentioning, when we're focused on that water droplet sound, the rest of the artillery sound becomes muffled, almost as if it's showing another scene below or subdued by
another example of directing, right?
Hiding under a cavern below the battlefield, whatever.
But that would be my argument as to why you're not actually getting a true conflict.
But I'm
here.
Not saying it's a conflict.
You're saying
no,
war.
I'm not.
War is conflict.
Okay, so then it's not a war. It's a decimation. There's one side. Everything's working together to wipe out everything else. There's no battle back.
I'm arguing that too. It's just... Everything is just working together. When water, a life-giving idea, is making droplets, the cacophony of the artillery, the rockets, the bullets, the what have you, takes a step back and gives it a place to stand out.
I think
that is it takes a muffle. You just hear the plunk.
But that's
everything
not
happens on this album in such a subtle fashion that I'm not sure I can really go 100% to your side, Matt, because there's just no culmination here. It means decimation, but steady decimation. Is that what you're describing?
Sort of.
There's no ultimate thing. I mean, I don't know. I don't think I see that from water droplets necessarily. I mean, everything trades out for one another, but then by the end, everything is pretty unchanging in this track. This is another one of those things. I gotta point out a pretty static musical arc. It's a cacophony, sure, if you're interested in cacophony, but I feel like there would be greater peaks and valleys in this track if such a heavy-handed, warlike environment was really that. I just don't think there's enough musical material to support it. That's my claim.
It's frankly, we talked about this much earlier, but the lens is just focusing all over the place, because this becomes, through the fact that it really doesn't change elements, a single picture, but the focus is dramatically shifting as the song goes along. You're seeing a foreground piece, a background piece. It's 2.5-dimensional art.
Is
it's
it
not
dramatic,
changing.
though? Again, I say subtle. I don't say dramatic.
I think that the changing in tones from the water droplet to the cacophony fades at a gradual rate, so it does kind of subdue to the other. I feel like regardless of what the scenes are, it definitely goes from one scene to another scene to both scenes at the same time, kind of showing a constant current momentum of
This is
both.
astounding considering that just a few weeks ago I watched All Quiet on the Western Front, the 1930 version, which has spectacular directing, by the way, especially for its time, in the early days of sound here. Examples of scene work being shot on the battlefield they created. They're not in a sound stage. They have the trench, and the camera actually starts rolling along the trench to see one one rifleman after the other, and some of them get shot, some of them lurch forward, some of them are firing, some of them get shot back, but that, like, diagonal angle, you really lets you see as much of the battlefield at once. So, I don't know, here, I want to buy all this. I really do. It's just again, I'm thinking this specifically through the idea of ballistics and forms of ballistics. If you see that as warfare, well, great, because that's certainly a prime example of ballistics. But there are a lot of ballistics in the natural world as well. And I just leave the door open that's almost just as much chaos and could be just as threatening, perhaps. A ballistic is an asteroid hitting the Earth, and man didn't cause it.
That's fair enough.
All right.
Well, man could have created it prehistorically.
Track 12. Sun.
What?
Sun. We're on Sun.
SON, as in daughter, son, someone from your lineage.
So,
Thank you.
This song, I mean, my biggest gripe with this song, as we get into it already, is it was the most predictable thing on the album. And it wasn't even that predictable, but it has a finality. It feels like an epilogue.
It became an ending.
Yeah.
A very definitive, but still not quite resolute ending.
Yeah, I mean, you can pinpoint when the credits start crawling, when they're giving the story. It really did reek of typical ending to a something, movie, whatever, movement.
There's a lack of beat work until like maybe 2 minutes in. Up until then, it's mostly just more electronic humming. They grow, they recede, they grow, they recede, as if that's kind of like your reflecting moment before the beat work starts, ending in, and that's your ultimate credits.
It's surrealistic phasing.
Yeah, and I find the same stuff here. It incorporates different things like that. Like a bongo drum sound. Okay, almost. It's acoustic. It's down to earth, and that occurs in just like the last 2 triplets of each beat. Almost, but it's almost. This is an odd observation, a very odd observation. But it feels like this is maybe the one moment where we have the most human rhythm possible.
Well, if my warlike...
Because I don't... Well, I need to explain, because that's not exactly... I almost don't quite hear this as in those like last 2 perfectly even triplets per beat. Like, if you divide it up in 3s, I would hear this on the last 2. But it doesn't seem quite that perfect. It seems like it might be just like a semi-quaver or something like that. Just like a hair too late or a hair too early. And that is very out of character for this album.
Yeah. I mean, also, as a resolution goes, that human element that you might be hearing in this track, if we are to take my metaphor right or wrong about this kind of war, this decimating war, this is that survival, that human who survived after the giant battle.
I thought you were going to go very simply to the idea that the track's titled Sun.
Well, yeah, or it's the son of.
Son of. That
people.
The survivor. The
lone son survivor, yeah. I mean...
The prodigal son.
The prodigal son, that was the word I was looking for. I don't know, I feel like this track, of all the tracks on the record, was the most predictable and the most cliche feeling. Whether it was intentional or not, and for the arc is not very foreign. I just kind of went... I kind of sighed, because I was like, oh, okay, well, this is cool, but, I saw it coming.
This is the second week in a row where I just can't agree with you on the final track. I don't see the giant cliche that you see. I see perhaps the same problems here that maybe I've seen in certain other tracks on this album. If you see that as being particularly problematic in the last track, for being the last track, then of course that would lend itself to being more of a cliche, because it's the wrap-up, and we all are just so keen to sniff out, cliched wrap-ups. But I don't think it's more problematic than any other track necessarily.
I don't think so.
It has
either.
some of the same pitfalls.
I think I have the same amount of problems for different reasons on this track.
That's fair.
I really only have one complaint, and it's the first time I really feel like I have a complaint in this album, which is it feels a little bit too long. This is the only track, the only piece that, to me, I really was getting a little bit bored.
I mean, I get a sense of that, too. I felt it, dragged a little bit, too. I would give you that.
Honestly, for me, this was the only track that did that.
Well, yeah, and for me, I'd already made that complaint a few times. But I do feel like every time that it's dragged, it's not like, God, when's it going to end?
He just wants to further exemplify that moment.
And so
He wants to reiterate it.
Uh-huh. And it gives you that kind of... It brings it to your attention without it actually being a burden. Whereas in a lot of other tracks we've reviewed, when something becomes repetitive, it's almost groan-worthy, like, come on, end.
Well, there's also the fact that he doesn't want this album to end. His own words, it's not the goal. You just want to look at the flight. That's what he's talking about, the actual movement. The point A to point B, well, you take away those 2 points and you just are looking at the arc. Solens Arc. So maybe the track and the album itself shouldn't have a resolution to it. If you're taking it from an artistic argument, I mean, that's a pretty damn good argument why you shouldn't feel the track culminate.
Yeah, I think that does make a lot of sense. I mean, considering the idea that it's an arc of flight, having something so cliche, wrap-up-y kind of a track does detract from that overall arc theme, if that's where you were. I personally wasn't, because I was more... I enjoyed this album a few times before I had his specific description, so I took it where I took it, not where he took it.
Yeah, actually, most of our observations were made prior to reading his press release for this album.
Well, sure, that was the point I made in the beginning, is that you have to grapple with your impressions versus what he intended it to be. And we did it in exactly the order I would ask anyone else to do it. Listen to the work, and then read the write-up, because you need to really see how well it worked in the aftermath. If it's just completely off base, maybe he wasn't so successful.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point to make. I feel like with artists who do this, make a summation before their album comes out or after, we've made fun of certain artists for doing it too much.
It's a very easy thing to do. You could write something, you could write your words to the music in the aftermath. Well, that doesn't mean the inspiration was behind it. That means you ascribed things. Like for instance, we very often do. Sometimes maybe we're right, sometimes maybe we're wrong. It really is going to depend on the listener in the end. So whatever you write in your liner notes is really just for fan service and people who like to soak up knowledge about artists and concepts.
Yeah, that's fair. I think it's time we get into the wrap-up, so let's start figuring out where we are with this. The first thing I want to say to John is that I'm so grateful you didn't bring us under the deep chord, because that's what I was afraid of.
I did my best to bring something in a similar artistic vein.
To Boards of Canada.
To Boards of Canada.
Yeah, which you did.
What I tried with deep chord. What I succeeded almost with Aphex, but now I think I got it.
Speaking of Aphex and those other bands that we've reviewed instrumental, I mean, it's hard to not compare to other instrumental albums we've done, because we don't do as many instrumental albums as we do albums in song lyric format. But for me, it's an interesting relationship I have with this record, because now that I've listened to it a few times, I don't know, like, I felt like Boards of Canada had more standout moments, like bigger moments, but as a whole, cohesively, this album pulled together a lot more than than Boards Canada did.
Well, Boards was apocalyptic.
Yeah.
It was definably apocalyptic.
And almost on the nose that way.
Yeah.
And whereas this, it makes you think a lot more. I mean, we had a lot of disagreements that weren't all wrong. They were all different.
And by the way, since he keeps referring to Boards of Canada, that's back in episode 54, and the album we're referring to specifically is Tomorrow's Harvest.
And I just feel like this one, to me, really, I connected a lot more to it through all of it. Or at least my mind was going more. I was creating these scenes, these scenarios, these movements, these motions, and I didn't really get that in everything in Boards of Canada. But that said, this is not about comparing it. Let's focus on what we have here by Kangding Ray. I think that it's very interesting how he really did weave these tracks so strongly together. This is the first time I really did have a strong sense of arc and theme before I even came to the podcast, to our listening party that we do before every episode. I really did have something established in my head. It wasn't a realization we made here. We were all kind of on our own pages once we showed up, which is unique for us. Usually we do have a lot of aha moments listening together, which is what the group listen is designed for. I kind of had those. There were no real big aha moments. It was just kind of moving through, understanding as I went. I know Steve's going to speak a little more to what Kangding Ray specifically said about this record, but for me, the arc and theme I created in my own head is pretty strong. And besides that, I don't know if I enjoyed the record specifically, but I was engaged in the record the whole time. And that was interesting to me, because there was no moment where, even though there were moments where I felt that it was repetitive, there were no moments where I went, I'm out. I'm got peace. I'm gone, guys. I'm done on this track. I never really left this thing that was created, this scene, this location. I was immersed the whole time, and I think that's important. And I did strongly emotionally connect on several tracks, whether it was fear, realization, acceptance, denial. There were these emotions throughout the record, and a fluidity, too, that can't be denied. So, we mentioned Liquid on multiple tracks. So I think for me, it stands at a solid 4.25 for me. I really did get invested. I think what would have taken it to that 4.5 or higher is if I didn't actually step out even enough to say that it felt repetitive. Even though it didn't remove me from the songs completely, I did acknowledge it. And if I were really, truly immersed, I wouldn't have noticed the repetitiveness. So that's what hurts it a little for me.
So what was it?
So 4.25 for me.
4.25.
It's a very strong record. I really like what he did. I don't know that I would get into this album a lot, but as an experience, I would definitely put it on from time to time.
Okay. Let me approach this in a way that we have avoided for the duration of the album. Discuss our impressions, and then discuss what it means from what the artist intended. I'm going to go with what the artist intended first, and I'm specifically going to refer back to those liner notes that John read earlier on. I know it was a while ago, about an hour and a half ago, so in case you forgot them, I'm going to walk through these words here and actually address whether some of the things were actually accomplished. A stone throw just to watch it fly. So we have complete for the sake of it right here, essentially. That's what this album feels like. I'm with it so far. A projectile launched for the sole purpose of drawing a ballistic trajectory in the sky. The Solens Arc is what remains after the subtraction of the goal. Goals which we repeatedly were trying to apply and add, though he mentions subtract. Which is, it tells me that we're playing right into his hands. That we're trying to add goals and ascribe things to ballistic trajectories. And, well, what is the ballistic trajectory? Is it warfare? Is it the arc of civilization itself? We had a lot of theories here. In the end of the day, perhaps it's everything, perhaps it's nothing. When you subtract the goal, he continues, all you're left with is a simple parabolic curve, defined by gravity, impulse, and starting angle. Just the angles that were present in the music itself. No target to hit, no catharsis to wait for. Just the beauty of the flight. The arc as the purpose in the form of 4 variations, which we had constructed from disintegrated melodic textures, and they were barely melodic to begin with, let alone having the chance to disintegrate, and also dismantled beats, which we certainly felt. But sometimes they were more regular rather than dismantled. Each of the sequences are assembled seamlessly into dense, evolving compositions, while keeping their autonomy and their role in the global dramaturgy. Now this is interesting because here he does actually mention one of these goals. If you're considering the global dramaturgy, well, that's a very broad statement, but that intends to incorporate very much of the kinds of things that we would say. Perhaps not everything we said, and perhaps some things we did not say. But certainly in the global discourse, it's important. Pointillist serial loops morph into abrasive rave anthems. Broken club rhythms are refitted into uneven patterns, like deconstructivist sound architectures. Now that is probably the biggest, like WTF in these entire liner notes. But read through it. I mean, this is like abrasive rave anthems. We frequently mentioned that there were certain moments on this album in which it started to sound just like generic techno. It slipped back into those, I'm going to say, pitfalls at times, but then he mentions they're refitted into uneven patterns like deconstructivist sound architectures. Well, even though those 3 words are just, I'm going to throw out the word pretentious here, but maybe also chalk it up to poor translation. He's French or German. But, I do see the idea. He's breaking down what should be something that's very digestible and very tried and true into something that really does have an artistic goal. All this is successful. And finally, industrial techno-stompers dissolve into granular sound waves and filtered space pads before being overtaken by cinematic drums and rising arpeggios. Well, even though I believe the last line there is a little bit of a cop-out because it simply describes what goes on without necessarily applying the earlier artistic motive, it's still accurate. This is what occurred. Okay, great. You defined your work. From there, I'm pretty much left with the idea that this is a 95% success. In terms of just describing arcs themselves, I mean, it's interesting how frequently we go back to musical arc, because we're always looking for the emotion that it provides us, and he's actually just looking for literal arcs, the arc that we're left with, and we're left to associate and interpret through the lens of physics in the known universe. I mean, that's one thing, but then there's the other thing. The musical arc that we do frequently, which is what we ascribe, and it's how we feel. It's the emotion that we're left with, and that's my segue ultimately for the latter, which was previously the former. Figure that out. And that's ultimately our impressions. So forget the liner notes, forget everything I just mentioned, and just think, how did you feel during this piece? What did it accomplish for you? From an artistic standpoint, it set out a goal which I don't think is going to reach everybody. I don't think everyone is always interested in just hearing, well, arcs from various sources. But Matt's right on one account. It made you think. It really better make you think. You have to listen with an open ear. That's part of what being a dedicated listener is all about, and being a keen listener, a critical listener. It's just important to take those things into account. But what is he accomplishing for the rest? What is he accomplishing for those two spectrums that we laid out at the very beginning? Which on one hand are, are you going to dance to it? Are you going to groove along to this? Or are you just going to sit and think and really ponder? And then how successful is it from that perspective? It has these arcs, but sometimes I just don't feel the musical arc within it. It doesn't seem to make it enjoyable. It doesn't seem to provide the emotion. I know the emotion's not there. Subtraction of the goal. He puts it out there. He's not trying to provide emotion. It's a stone throw just to watch it fly. So all we have is just that for the sake of it. It is a work of art for the sake of it. How much closer could you ever get to saying art for the sake of art? All this leaves me wildly confused.
Okay, well, guess what, Steve? We rate stuff, so give it to us. Dramatic pause.
Boards of Canada was a 4 in my previous rating because of the fact that it explored in a post-apocalyptic world, but it was pretty concise in that fashion. And I'm going to repeat what you said. Well, yeah, this perhaps was not as concise, but it does offer a little bit more. For instance, it's not just portraying a world, it's portraying an idea. That idea, elusive as it may be, is worth a solid 0.25. It's worth a solid quarter. I love setting, but I do love ideas too. No, I'm going exactly between 4 and 4.25. It is a 4.1.
3. We're gonna round
up.
Right,
we're gonna do that.
You
We're
only
gonna
get
do that.
2 points.
No.
You only get 2 decimal points after the number.
All right. That's true.
4.13.
4.13.
Wow. Again, Steve, paving the way for new rating numbers. John, we've said a lot.
There is something that's a little bit unsaid, and that is the fact that while we're ascribing a bunch of different ideas to the arcs themselves, the contained units here, and trying to make up stories, well, they are stories. And I think we're running a little bit too far with the idea of the physical arc, of the actual motion of an object that has been thrown. Because it's an allegory used continuously in so many other mediums itself. Story arcs, music arcs, just the idea of point A to point B. How do you get from point A to point B? We brought it up a few times. Well, this is just pure description of that movement. It's not just arc, it's the movement of location without the locations themselves, without a beginning or an ending. That's the distillation of this idea. And each trio of tracks, each of the 4 different arcs presented here, does it. It really does it for me. Because I'm left wanting with endings. I'm left puzzling over settings at points. I'm left trying to figure out, well, who and what is doing things, and what are they doing? Well, by the second track of each of these songs, you can kind of get the idea of where they're going, and by the ending, you can kind of figure out what they're doing, but there's no resolution. It is so devious to leave a person wanting so deeply to have a resolution and just never giving it to you. I love it. I love that idea. Musically, it stays within very safe realms, but it does so much with those very defined and even tones that it's hard to fault it for that. The layering is masterful, but maybe some more actual experimentation with the instruments, with tones. Maybe that would have really put it into upper echelon ideas. Maybe a little bit more definition, or even a little bit less definition. Taking a little bit more of a step back so that we're not going, oh, it's war, or oh, it is a river, or maybe it's this or that or the other thing. Maybe those little bit, those expansion of those ideas or the extraction of those ideas could have done this a service to really put it into near 5 territory. Because as art, it's hard to argue. I mean, it does accomplish so much in that respect.
I do have to interject just to comment on your concept of an arc that doesn't necessarily satisfy you as being just as powerful as an arc that, of course, provides the traditional resolution. But the arc that I was ascribing to it, that I claimed that it did not have necessarily, it is not implying that arcs need to have musical resolution. I'm simply saying that there are certain tracks in here that I think could have been done out of order. I don't think you would have noticed. I think we would have simply ascribed different things on it. I think
I would argue
there's
that.
Displacement in this record, and,
I would argue
things
that.
he gets away with as a result. That's it.
Yeah, I don't see that.
Oh, okay.
I don't see some of the length problems you guys have. But
I'm
not,
you know, just
well, with the individual
placement
tracks.
problems.
Individual tracks, you two did say a couple of things were a little too long. I don't see much of that until Sun, the final track, but it's almost the last little shot in the eye of just is it going somewhere? Is it going somewhere? Nope. Well, you know what? It's art, and that's it. It really does distill. This is a true art album, but it doesn't quite reach those upper levels. I'm right on board with the two of you. It's a 4.25. It's straddling the line of the artistic expression that Boards did with the catchiness and the immersion that Aphex was able to do. And both of those were in the same category. They were both, for me, around a 4.25, if not exactly that. And I would rank this up there as far as both the combination of enjoyment and how thought-provoking it is. It straddles between exactly what those two did for me. So I really can't separate it from that category, from that level.
I think there's a safeness in his brilliance.
Yeah, I would agree. I think we're all kind of agreement in that.
This is his 4th album, and he keeps doing, and I've seen some of his actual physical artwork. He keeps going the extra little distance, and people are ranting and raving that this was the most experimental and the most out there. I'm kind of afraid what he's going to be in like in 10, 15 years, and still trying to push the envelope, still trying to refine it. That might be like some truly effed up stuff.
Could be.
And I'm scared, but I'm kind of hoping for it too.
Yeah, that safeness will keep it from upper echelon to me. As Matt said, aha moments are so important, but that's clearly not what his goal is here.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, it's just that the aha moments are the things that are born out of brilliance, serendipity, and also a lot of hard labor. Some of this, I think was a natural experiment of more of it was a thesis. It was a thesis,
absolutely,
and that idea is worth that 4.25 because you will never hear it done again. Right. Actually, 4.25 or 4.3, we're all pretty much the same territory. It's no big deal. So yeah, there you are. From there, I guess we'll go to a little topic that I hinted at toward the beginning of this album, and that's, of course, the case. What we were dealing with is the idea that it's almost a visual art piece in the visuals that you get as a result of this, right? Mm-hmm. Even if that visual is just what he put forth, the simple ballistic art. It's something to look at. And there's a visual art piece within it. Of course, it helps that he himself is a visual artist and is capable of very, very intriguing things that are all over his website. Machines that are art in themselves, and there's so much, cross-pollination here with just what this is, which is machine in the music. And it got me thinking about, a certain discussion we were having before the podcast, which was the line between, let's say, a visual art piece and what we traditionally call the music video, where the music is the initial spark. And then it took quite a long time before we actually started, laying visuals to it. Of course, earlier than what we see as the traditional music video, which is like an art piece incorporating a visual element to the music element. We had other examples where they were integrated, like, for instance, the musicals that you'd get back in the 30s that were very grand and experimenting with interesting directing styles. Like, you'd establish an array of dancers in a circle and then put the camera on the ceiling and look down at the array of dancers doing kind of like Rockette-esque moves. And they were far more elaborate because, of course, you now have the ability to change where the viewer is via the camera location. Their eyeball, perspective. The eyeball is above, it's below, it's through glass, it's through water. Fascinating things were done back then, but it was never applied to, let's say, individual or broad art forms like singles, like albums, until like the 60s and 70s. Then we get our traditional music video, where always the music video seems to be the supplement to the music itself, which should easily be a standalone thing. Shouldn't need the video, but it's nice to have it, and it just will take you to that extra level. But then there's the flip side, and this is of course what visual artists have been doing for a while now, incorporating a musical element into their visual work. And in those cases, often the goal is really more about the visual sensations that the visual work of art is providing you. And then the music is meant to kind of guide it along. Like, a perfect example I would have, in the flip side, would be the kind of work that we saw from the Quay brothers back in, let's say, the 1980s. They were these big guys in claymation, right? They would do a lot of model work, and they would have, it's like stop motion. They would be filming this, and of course you see their characters. They're very, very macabre figurines moving around and performing very macabre acts, but in the background you would always have this extra oomph, which was the audio element that seemed to set the stage a little bit. And he would use they would use classical pieces like Janacek and that sort of thing. But where is the line between each? If it's simply the impetus of one to the other, then where is the middle ground, and when does one cross the line?
I mean, I think it depends. You mentioning perspective is very important, because I think perspective on the topic is also really important. I mean, also with music videos, there's been a lot of change to them with the YouTube generation. A lot of people have access to music and videos and artists that they might not have had before the internet age. I mean, what sparked me bringing up music videos in the first place is Knockjaw, not very frequently mentioned on the podcast, introduced me to a band this past week that I've since become kind of obsessed with. But what hooked me was a music video he suggested called Ghosts by Mystery Skulls. And what was interesting about this music video, typically a music video created by the artist has either a narrative or a visual or whatever that ascribes to the song. The song Ghosts is about someone fading away and becoming a ghost, which in a dance song is more of an ethereal, not very narrative thing. But the animated music video that a fan of the Mystery Skulls created, that I liked better than the official music video, had this whole narrative story within the song that for a moment you almost forget about the song and you're just watching the story, and the music is just a dialogue for that music video, which is interesting to me.
That's fascinating, because I think I had the exact opposite reaction with the example I just brought up with the Quay brothers. Mm-hmm. A friend of mine who was very much into visual art and sculpture, right? She went to Yale for art, so she's very much in the conversation. And I just out of the blue thought to bring up the Quay brothers. She's like, "Oh, have you heard of them?" And of course she just jumped on it. She's like, "I love the Quay brothers. They're one of my favorites. I've been following them for years." And then I thought just to sort of like enter this in with a little bit of bonding. Well, it's like, what did you feel about this particular video and the use of music in it? Interestingly, she did not notice
The music
at all.
Yeah.
For her, that was a visual art piece, and the music was so secondary. For me, honestly, it took control.
Yeah.
I had the experience where the music was almost more like, all right, I'm watching the visuals take place, and of course you have to see it to believe it. Just search anyone who's listening. Just search Quay Brothers on YouTube, and you'll see a whole slew of videos to get you started at least on what they've been doing for the last 30 years, and they definitely. I know that their goal is probably more visual, and that the music was sometimes an afterthought, but in that case, it boils down to more perspective. If you're maybe a more musically minded person than visual art, for instance, I never went to school for visual art. I'm the antithesis of her. I went to school for music. I could barely draw a circle. But, like, this, so naturally, there's probably some things that are going to get me more than others. Not that I'm not intrigued by watching, but certainly there's moments in the music where I felt the artist's goal in timing there. And that's the kind of things that you can do with music that you can't necessarily do with art, is incorporate timing. Those peaks and valleys, and, for instance, the things we were lacking today, those aha moments, that when they sync up with the visual, that's going to just, blow your mind in a certain way. I couldn't imagine anyone viewing these types of videos without listening to the musical component.
Well, it all depends on the order in which a product is produced. I think that can be one of the defining factors on whether it's going to be one side or the other. If you decide on a visual scene work and then try to find or create the music for it, versus you're creating music and then trying to find an animator or a framework or a director that fits that vision, can be very defining for the pieces itself, for what we get in these combinations. But on a side note, I'm going to talk a little anecdote. One of my favorite things to find on YouTube nowadays is like music videos and other things from my favorite songs. Like, what are people doing with these pieces? And one of the common ones, which I immediately went to when we started talking about this, was a speaker with water on it. The vibration of that actual sound translated to water is, when I see it, kind of magical in some ways, especially for the guys that really go the distance and do it in a really interesting way. It's the actual sound being shown in its interaction with the physical world. That might be my favorite idea of marrying the visual and the audio together, purely from just an artistic idea, showing the physical changes to the world around that the audio is doing.
But that wasn't a work done by today's artist, David Letelier? That was something separate. It was just very interesting.
It's just random videos I found, and some of them are really, really powerful, really magical when you get down to it.
It's just because of how he describes what he does, as an attempt to express sound as a form in movement. It seems like the kind of thing that would be up in his alley.
He's a lot crazier than that.
In his ilk.
Yeah. I've only touched the surface of the sort of things he does in the physical spectrum, and it's really wicked pieces.
Well, I think that, like a lot of art, there are things that are definably A or B, which we talk about a lot. Then I think I like where John is, where it's kind of in the middle. It's all...
That's why I love the Quay Brothers, and I often say that, like the way I musicals are often, They go right up the same alley. I've said this about musicals before, just like I hinted about the musicals that were done in the 30s. Well, the bigger musicals that were done more recently, obviously on Broadway, and turned into full-on films, out-of-Broadway plays like West Side Story, Fiddler on the Roof. These are the kind of things that I find that they walk the middle, because you can't have one without the other. If I feel like you're missing the point if you go into these musicals and you miss a certain song or consider it secondary. On the grand musical, I think that's an important thing to incorporate. On the lesser, perhaps like musicals that perhaps just are not as known, I understand that there's a lot of cases where people just can't watch musicals because they see it as an interruption in their story. Well, for them, maybe they're visual pieces, maybe they're narrative type people.
I mean, it could be, but also, we were talking about this a little bit off the air, and Sarah mentioned that the stronger musicals succeed when the narrative is seamless with the music.
Yeah.
And I, like, you mentioned Fiddler on the Roof, which I just happened to watch recently. our guest panelist Parker, his fiance is converting to Judaism when they get married, and so there's been a lot of talking about culture and new stuff. And we mentioned Fiddler on the Roof. It's one of the most famous musicals, especially when it talks about Jews and culture. Especially in that town and what's going on. And it's a very popular musical, just flat out in its own right. So we rewatched it recently, and the story is so strong that you don't even notice the music sometimes, and that's like you notice the music, but you don't notice the break.
They are born out of the narrative.
Yeah, like and
when he sings "If I Were a Rich Man," it's not just a ditty; it's his longing. You're seeing the aspirations,
and it's his
you're seeing the aspirations of, in the end, a very small man in the grand scheme of things.
Yes.
The town is small; they're poor and pitiful, and they're being flushed out.
Yeah,
and so every single song serves to show. They show their small, sometimes petty customs. Matchmaker, find me a match. Okay, they're focused on that in the shadow of the much bigger thing, in that they're being flushed out of their town. That duality is very, very important. Again, you have to be aware of all these things. True, though, and we do go back to perspective, not everyone is as keen.
Sure.
And, I mean, if we're going to talk stuff like Fiddle on the Roof, I mean, the whole realm of more music-oriented movies in general. I mean, we've talked a lot about specific pieces like Scott Pilgrim versus the World, way back when we were doing our favorite compositional or scores or just
composers,
things like that. Back in the early years of this podcast, I mean, we were talking things like Sucker Punch and stuff like that. Frankly, when I'm thinking about it, I can't remember the soundtrack that well.
To what?
Things like Scott Pilgrim versus the World.
Oh, I remember perfectly. Song for song, note for note.
Can you remember the soundtrack?
I remember quite a bit.
Without the visuals.
Yes.
Can you remember the visuals without the soundtrack?
Yes.
Okay, see, I can't do that. If I'm thinking of
I actually think that was a success for me. Even though I'm not as video game oriented, that was definitely a success. I heard it in FYE the other day, and I was brought right back to the scene in the movie and could listen separately. It was working.
Yeah. For me, I can't really divert one from the other. When I'm thinking of the visuals, I can think of the visuals. But when I'm thinking of the music, I can't help but think of the visuals.
See, for me, the soundtrack was created in such a way for that movie specifically, and it's why I will sometime in the future, because I did a feature teasing it, do my article on comparing the music and the movie of Scott Pilgrim together. I think it was a brilliantly set up soundtrack, because the animator, the artist who, Brian Lee O'Malley, who's responsible for Scott Pilgrim, the writer and creator, those bands that Scott's either wearing a t-shirt of or in the comics he's wearing a t-shirt of are bands that he actually liked growing up in Toronto. And so they are so rooted in the story of that movie. But the songs themselves on their own right are great songs that stand out. And I think that's where that kind of dichotomy for me marries them and also separates them for me. And I'll get more into that when I eventually write that article.
True, and then I guess just because it's topical, and we were having this discussion a little bit earlier as well, in terms of the TV musical or the TV-friendly musical, something that's popular lately on ABC is Gallivant. And, it pursues... First of all, you have to be aware of the fact that it's pursuing a kind of a cliche.
Yeah.
It's a cliche from the beginning. In fact, you hear that in the opening track. It's just like it's a storybook cliche. It's in the music. They know what they're doing. But of course, that's like that TV attempt to follow every trendy thing.
Well, it's also they're winking very heavily at the camera constantly. It's a commentary on the events instead of a narrative push.
But the funny thing. And I'm not, I still don't know exactly where I lean on it. I think because it's very family friendly, I'm not really eyeballing it too much. But I understand what it was trying to pull, and that of course was the spoof on the poorly done musical.
Yeah.
The idea that the music is awkwardly yanking you from the narrative, right? And each and every piece of music in this show, Gallivant, seems to follow the same exact thing. It's like they know what they're doing, and they make a big joke out of it. It's constantly the butt of the entire show. So, it's almost just like today's album. It's the exact same concept. I see what it's doing. It might fail a little bit in the process because it's just so on point with its satire that it successfully puts me in the failed musical, rather than perhaps creating something that was enormously clever as a result. So, fascinating little lines we draw between successes and failures.
There's also, Glee. Oh my god. I tried really hard to get into that TV show. like really hard, because it's a great concept. Take music and try to tell a story with it. But the problem is they were taking music and shoehorning a story to fit the music, or vice versa, trying to make the song fit what the story was trying to convey. It's great music. It was an okay story, but they were separate elements, and really one detracted from the other as you're watching it.
Well, I'm not incredibly versed on Glee, but I do kind of
I did
feel
watch
that
the
it was
lie.
pursuing maybe even the progenitor of the same Gallivant notion. Like it was just trying to do the same thing, but in a high school environment.
I mean, I did watch over the first season.
Did you
and
find it successfully satirical?
I couldn't stay with it. I just couldn't stay with it because it was trying to be a little bit too much of a satire. It was trying to be too heavy in the irony when they're using certain songs, too heavy and on the nose when they're using other songs. I mean, it was going not for drama, but for drama, like the big overture, which for music and for high school, both, honestly, that is perfect. If you want high drama, if you want a lot of emotion, high school, music, seems like a match made in heaven. Didn't jive with me.
I still have to go back to satire on each front, though. In each case, it was trying to do something clever by shoehorning it, just as you put it. If you shoehorn it in, well, then you're kind of commenting on how poorly it is done by other forms of art, which may have really intended that it would not be as noticeable. But in these cases, I do believe it was intentional. It's just like, well, is that your type of is that your shtick? Is that your type of humor? Are you going to get your kicks out of watching something like that? Much like, let's say, I would enjoy watching an MST3K, because of how they set. Like, you got to love the bad,
Right. Well, I mean, in that point, it's laughing at something because it's terrible, which we all do for certain reasons, but it's a tricky bridge to cross when you've made the fourth Scorpion King movie as a gag, and it's purposely terrible. Do people really care at that point? It's that kind of a thing.
Yeah.
I want to admit something. I'm not a big fan of Mystery Science Theater anymore.
Well, it's been off for like 15 years.
I know, but I can't even rewatch the stuff, even though I loved it growing up. I don't know why.
Oh, that's a shame.
I just gotta say, I'm not a fan anymore.
That's a real shame.
Yeah. That's a shame because you're kind of alone, because we are totally still on board with it.
We are not friends.
I don't like people talking during my movies.
We saw it in the theater several times.
That's right. I will see Joel and Mike as many times as possible.
Yep.
And Crow.
And Crow. I think what we're saying here, instead of a summation, I present this. I would love for anyone listening, if you made it this far, which we love when you do.
Because today was rough.
Today was long. It was a long review. But if you made it this far, please tweet or comment on Facebook with the hashtag What's Your Art, and tell us, what's your music art? Like, where do you stand with this? Where do you stand with your perspective of, is it a visual promoted with music, or is it a music video that blends with the music? I'm curious what other people, how their perspective lays, because I think it can also be very heavily influenced on your personal perspective on it.
That is the ultimate, I think, conclusion of this discussion, if there is one. Personal perspective is the ultimate key. It was true for that with me and my friend, and it was true for you and Jose. Perspective is going to guide just about everything in the end. Perspective from the artist perspective and fans' perspective.
So tweet at us or comment on Facebook, Tumblr, and let us know what you think. You can ask us a question on the Tumblr account as well, so let us know. Let us go. So we have an unfortunate truth this week. No fan mail. Though we appreciate all the attention we've gotten, and thank you all for reaching out and continue to do so in the emails we have mentioned or other social medias I've mentioned ad nauseum. But so we're going to go back to our faithful spam emails.
Spam.
Because they don't stop hounding us. So, Steve, take it away.
All right. One of the huge benefits of digital photography is that apart from the initial cost of the camera, there is practically no cost involved. Contact the owner, find out their hourly rates, and visit the facilities. Just learn the lesson in your everyday experiences. If you fail, then don't quit. If you fail, then don't quit.
Huh.
Fascinating word choice.
And this was by...
This was by How to Take Better Photos.
Well, that seems to make sense.
Yeah, it was on a picture of Nelson Lugo.
Well, he's very photogenic.
So. You know what? Let's give this guy...
Apparently not.
No,
How to take better
give
photos.
This guy's email to Nelson, because That's mean.
That
he
is
should
mean.
say
That is mean.
something.
That is mean.
I like analyzing. I missed this.
Photo 72D needs to be improved.
And we kick it back to Steve immediately because he's picking our album for next week.
Yes, I am. All right.
This one's been a long time coming, too.
Long time coming. There are, every once in a while, those few bands that we follow for a long, long time. And certainly which predate monstrous podcasts in which we review every single album and dissect it one note at a time. I've been listening to the Decemberists for, I'm going to say, since 2004.
So a decade.
Yep, a solid decade. They had about 3 albums out at the time. No, not quite. 2 albums out at the time. They had Castaways and Cutouts, their debut, 2002. Absolutely loved it. They had Her Majesty, 2003. Absolutely loved it. Maybe it was 2005 that I got into them because that's when they came out with Picaresque, and I recall that lining up perfectly. Absolutely loved that album. I eagerly looked forward to their 2006, The Crane Wife. Absolutely loved it. In fact, had one of my favorite tracks of all time, the second track, The Island, a 3-part masterpiece that amounted to about 12 minutes in just one track. Oh, aha moments abound. And then they came out in 2009 with Hazards of Love, a concept album, the perfect culmination for what the Decemberists had been doing all those years. Everything, their entire shtick, made apparent in a vast storyline that, guess what, featured Shower Warden of My Brightest Diamond. Crossovers abound. And then they came out with King is Dead. King is Dead, 2011, a slight bit decline for me because it was a little poppier, but I still enjoyed it. In fact, it kind of had this resurgence with me. I grew in love with it more by just it being them. And I realize that's a little bit of a cop-out. Again, pre-Crash Chords days. Got to address that. But still, it's Colin Malloy. I love his voice. It's Jenny on the organ. It's everything that the Decemberists had. And it was present. Who cares if it's pop? It's just going to be my kind of pop. That's going to be a natural truth. And so now here we have a new album. It was released just this year. It's a 2015 album. We haven't had many of those yet because it's still early on. And this album is called What a Terrible World, What a Beautiful World. This is a very intriguing title. I've heard things about this album. I don't know how I'm going to take it yet. I just know that for the most part, aside from the slight turn, the Decemberists have never done me wrong. And they're the only band that I have ever been able to cite as a entire discography band. Like, I could dip into any song, I'm going to enjoy it just because it's them. And just because their shtick is as defined as ever and as refined as ever.
Well, I will say that I have heard the first single from the record, and I did really enjoy it. I also like the music video because it featured Nick Offerman of Parks and Rec fame. So I enjoyed it a lot. And there was a sense of macabre humor that they've had in the past in the video, which I enjoyed.
Oh, of course.
So
babies lying in gutters and such, you know.
So we will. Well, A Cautionary Song is actually often covered by the Wasties, which is not a family-friendly song, but it's still fun to hear Molly and Sarah sing, nonetheless. Well, I look forward to hearing it. I've been holding off because I knew we would be doing it, and I've become a more recent fan of their work, although I do like the history of their work. I started with The King is Dead, so I'm more favorable to that because I started with it, but I like the older stuff too. Anyway, I think this is a fantastic point.
Wait.
What?
You two get to talk about it.
Fine, John.
I've never really recognized Decemberist songs. I really can't pick them out from a lineup. So I'm doing something that Steve did for me. I'm going to be just freaking powering through their entire discography in preparation of this album. I have to give him that. He's been talking about this almost as long as I've been talking about Weezer. So, I mean, I got to give him the respect of that, right?
Steve might be able to do a supercut of him saying the Decemberists. It's possible.
The Decemberists.
It's possible.
I'm just not as I don't know.
He wouldn't do that to him because it's his job to do all those cuts and the bloopers. So
that's true because we don't do this.
That's true. I get the final say on the comedy.
You do,
or the riffing, as it were.
There you go.
But anyway, thank you for joining us for another week. We look forward to the Decemberists next week. And on that note, remember, music is life,
and life is good.
If you enjoyed this and other album analyses, topics, and guests, please subscribe to the Crash Chords podcast on iTunes, where you can also rate us and review us. For more media, also subscribe to Matt's one-on-one interview series, Crash Chords Autographs. To receive emails on all new content, subscribe at the top of our homepage. Also receive updates by liking us on Facebook, following us on Twitter at Crash Chords Web, our Tumblr, and our YouTube channel. And remember, keep the discussion going, because music is life, and life is good. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to share them in the comment board below each post. Otherwise, email us directly at admin@crashchords.com.